At 6:47 on a Tuesday evening, 200 homes lost power at the exact same second. No storm, no fallen tree, no warning from the utility company. Just darkness spreading street by street through a quiet, manicured neighborhood that prided itself on its perfect lawns and its perfect rules. 3 days earlier, a homeowners association board had voted to remove a gray metal box from a man's backyard because it clashed with the community's aesthetic guidelines. They called it an eyesore. They called it a violation. What they didn't call it, because they never bothered to ask, was the transformer that powered nearly every house on the block. By the time a utility engineer stood in that dark cul-de-sac asking one simple question, why did 200 homes just go dark? The answer was already sitting in a filing cabinet, buried under 6 months of certified letters nobody on that board had bothered to read. Daniel Ferris had spent 22 years designing power distribution systems before he ever thought about retiring somewhere quiet. He wasn't the kind of man who raised his voice. He measured things: risk, tolerance, load capacity, the way other people measured moods. When he and his wife Carol bought their home in Willow Creek Estates, they weren't looking for a battle. They were looking for a cul-de-sac with mature oak trees, a decent school district, and enough distance from the city to finally breathe. Willow Creek Estates looked, from the entrance sign onward, like the kind of place that had its act together. Uniform mailboxes, trimmed hedges, a community newsletter that arrived every month with photographs of the yard of the season winner smiling next to a bird bath. It was the sort of neighborhood that sold itself on order. And order, as Daniel would come to learn, was a currency some people were willing to spend other people's peace to protect. The Homeowners Association was run by a 5-person board, and its president, a woman named Linda Whitmore, had held the position for 9 years. She'd built a small empire out of committee meetings and violation notices, the kind of authority that exists nowhere on any deed, but somehow governs everything anyway. Linda didn't do confrontation the way most people imagined it. She did it in the passive bureaucratic register of certified mail and county code citations, always signed sincerely on behalf of the board. Her weapon wasn't anger. It was paperwork and the quiet, corrosive certainty that she was always technically following the rules she had mostly written herself. When Daniel and Carol moved in, they inherited something most new homeowners never think to ask about: a pad-mount transformer sitting near the rear property line, tucked behind a stand of holly bushes the previous owner had planted specifically to screen it from view. It wasn't decorative, it wasn't optional. It was a piece of utility infrastructure, installed under a recorded easement nearly 30 years earlier, quietly converting high-voltage current into something 200 nearby homes could actually use. Daniel recognized it the moment he walked the property during the final walkthrough. He'd designed dozens just like it. He mentioned it to the real estate agent almost as a footnote, the way you'd mention a fuse box. Nothing to worry about, just part of the grid, doing its job in the background of people's lives, the way infrastructure always does, until the day it doesn't. For the first 2 years, nobody said a word about it. The holly bushes did their job. The transformer hummed quietly behind them, invisible to anyone who knew to look. Daniel kept the area clear as the easement required, and otherwise forgot about it entirely, the way you forget about the water main under your street or the cell tower disguised as a pine tree 3 blocks over. The trouble started, as it so often does in places like Willow Creek, with a new landscaping initiative. The board had approved a community beautification standard, a 14-page document outlining acceptable exterior colors, approved plant species, and maximum visible utility equipment per lot. Nobody remembered voting on the last clause. It had appeared, as these things do, buried in an amendment passed during a sparsely attended spring meeting, the kind where 3 people show up and somehow speak for 400 households. Daniel first heard about it through a neighbor,
a friendly enough man named Roy, who mentioned almost in passing over the fence that the board had been asking questions about the green box in the Ferris backyard. Daniel laughed it off. He assumed it was a misunderstanding, the kind that gets cleared up with a 5-minute conversation and a copy of the easement documentation. He had no idea that assumption would cost him the next 8 months of his life, or that the woman signing those letters had no intention of being corrected by anyone, least of all a homeowner with an engineering degree and a folder of facts. What Daniel didn't yet understand, what almost none of the 200 households around him understood either, was that the transformer sitting behind his holly bushes wasn't just his problem. It was theirs. Every one of them was drawing power through that quiet gray box without ever having looked at it twice. And the board that governed their pristine little slice of suburbia was about to make a decision so profoundly ignorant of how their own neighborhood functioned that it would end not just in an outage, but in an unraveling.
The first letter arrived on a Thursday. Daniel remembers it because Carol brought in the mail and set it on the kitchen counter with the kind of exaggerated eye roll reserved for jury duty summonses and dentist reminders. Neither of them knew yet that it was the opening move in something far larger, the first thread in a mistake that would eventually cut the lights on an entire community and expose, in the process, exactly how little the people running it actually understood about the ground beneath their own feet. It read as polite in the way that only institutional cruelty can be polite. It cited Section 4.2 of the Community Aesthetic Guidelines, noted a visible utility structure exceeding permitted screening standards, and requested that the homeowner submit a remediation plan within 30 days. There was no mention of what exactly the structure was. There was no indication anyone from the board had walked the property, checked county records, or consulted the utility company. There was only the quiet procedural certainty of a violation notice, generated the way all of them were generated, from a checklist, not a conversation. In response, Daniel did what any reasonable person would do. He responded in writing, calmly and specifically. He explained that the structure in question was a utility transformer, installed under a recorded easement that predated the HOA's own governing documents. He attached a copy of the easement. He explained in plain language that the transformer served not just his home, but a significant portion of the surrounding grid. He offered, as a gesture of goodwill, to plant additional screening if that would satisfy the board's aesthetic concerns, so long as proper utility clearance was maintained. He assumed that would be the end of it. It was not. 3 weeks later, a second letter arrived, and this one was different in tone, though it never quite crossed into anything a lawyer could call a threat. It reiterated the original violation, added a daily fine accruing from the original notice date, and included a line that would later become impossible for the board to explain away. It stated that utility easements do not supersede community aesthetic covenants, and directed the homeowner to coordinate independent removal or relocation of the unauthorized structure within 60 days, or the board would explore board-authorized remediation options. That sentence Daniel read 3 times. As an engineer, he understood immediately what it implied and what it revealed. The board wasn't confused about what the transformer was. They had simply decided it didn't matter. Somewhere in a conference room with folding chairs and a whiteboard covered in landscaping mock-ups, someone had made the determination that a recorded utility easement, a legal instrument older than half the board members' time in the neighborhood, was subordinate to a 14-page beautification pamphlet. He called the utility company first, not out of panic, but out of professional habit. He wanted a formal letter on record confirming the transformer's function and the legal protections around it. The utility company was slow to respond, the way large organizations often are about problems that haven't become emergencies yet. A representative eventually confirmed by email that the easement was valid, that the equipment served the surrounding distribution loop, and that any unauthorized interference with the equipment would be a serious matter. But the email stopped short of anything urgent sounding, buried in the kind of corporate language that reads as reassurance to a company and as ambiguity to everyone else.
That email Daniel forwarded to the board immediately. He requested in writing that they cease any further action until the matter could be reviewed with the utility company directly. He offered, in writing, to arrange a joint meeting. He offered, more than once, to simply walk the property with a board member and show them in person exactly what they were dealing with.
He received no response. What he received instead, 6 weeks later, was a notice of a special assessment, a lump sum fine for continued noncompliance, along with language warning that failure to remit payment could result in a lien against the property. It was at this point that Carol, who had been watching her calm, methodical husband grow quieter and more clipped over dinner each week, finally asks him outright whether they should just get a lawyer. Daniel's answer was measured, the way all his answers were. He said the paperwork would speak for itself eventually. He believed, with the stubborn faith of a man who had spent his career trusting documentation over drama, that reason would win simply by existing on the record long enough. What he didn't yet grasp was that Linda Whitmore wasn't interested in being right. She was interested in being obeyed. 9 years of unchallenged authority had convinced her that the board's decisions were, by definition, correct, and that any resistance to them was simply a homeowner who hadn't yet learned how things worked in Willow Creek. She had faced pushback before, a fence height dispute, a paint color disagreement, a family who'd fought and lost over an unapproved shed, and in every case, the homeowner had eventually folded. Fines accumulated faster than patience. People paid to make the letters stop. Daniel didn't fold, and that, more than anything, seemed to irritate the board more than the transformer itself ever had. At the next open meeting, held in the community clubhouse under fluorescent lighting and a banner still hanging from someone's retirement party, Daniel attended in person for the first time. He brought copies of the easement. He brought the utility company's email. He asked, calmly, for the matter to be tabled pending a proper review. He was given 3 minutes at the podium per the board's own bylaws on public comment, and was then thanked for his input before the board moved directly to a vote on remediation timelines. As if his 3 minutes had been a formality to be endured rather than information to be considered. The vote passed 4-1. Only one board member, a quiet man near retirement who rarely spoke, voted against it, and he would later tell a local reporter that he hadn't fully understood what he was voting on, only that everyone else seemed so certain. Certain was the word that stuck with Daniel afterward. Nobody on that board had asked a single technical question. Nobody had requested documentation from the utility company directly. Nobody, in 8 months of correspondence, had once used the word transformer correctly in a sentence. They called it a box, a structure, an eyesore, an installation, anything but what it actually was, as though naming it accurately might force them to reckon with what removing it would mean. A folder was where it started, not out of any grand strategy, but out of the same instinct that had made him a good engineer for over 20 years. Document everything, because someday someone is going to ask what went wrong, and the answer needs to already be written down. He printed every letter. He saved every email. He logged every phone call with a date, a time, and a summary. Carol used to tease him about his obsessive record-keeping when they first married. She didn't tease him anymore. She'd started keeping copies, too. The final notice arrived in early autumn, in an envelope indistinguishable from all the others, except for what was inside. The board had voted, it read, to authorize professional remediation of the unauthorized structure, to be conducted by a licensed contractor at the homeowner's expense, with the work scheduled for the following week unless the homeowner completed removal independently before that date. He called the utility company again. He called the county planning office. He even called an attorney, finally, who told him, with the particular calm of someone who has seen this exact situation before and knows precisely how it ends, that what the board was describing wasn't remediation. It was interference with protected utility infrastructure, and if they went with it, the consequences would extend far beyond a lawsuit. He tried one more time to warn them. He sent a final letter,
certified, return receipt requested, spelling out in the plainest language he could manage exactly what would happen if unlicensed personnel disturbed a live pad-mount transformer serving an active distribution loop. He copied the utility company, he copied the county, he kept a copy for the folder. Delivered not in writing, but through a curt phone call from Linda Whitmore herself, the board's response was that the homeowner's continued obstruction would only delay the inevitable, and that the community's aesthetic standards were not open to negotiation. The work, she said, would proceed as scheduled.
Daniel hung up the phone, sat down at his kitchen table, and for the first time in 8 months, he didn't feel frustrated. He felt something closer to disbelief, the specific disbelief of a man who has just watched someone walk with total confidence directly toward a cliff they refuse to believe exists. He opened his folder, added the call log, and waited. The morning of the scheduled remediation was unremarkable in every way except one. The sky was overcast, the kind of flat gray that made the whole street look slightly washed out, and a small pickup truck pulled up outside the Ferris property just after 9. There was no marked utility vehicle, no orange safety cones, no lockout-tagout equipment, no insulated gloves, none of the protective procedures that anyone trained to work near energized electrical equipment would have insisted on before touching anything. There was a contractor Linda Whitmore had hired through a general landscaping service, a man with a trailer full of hand tools and a work order that described the job as removing an unsightly metal utility box from the rear of the property. From his kitchen window, Daniel watched. He had already called the utility company one final time that morning, requesting an emergency hold on the property, but the request was still working its way through a call center queue, trapped in the same bureaucratic slowness that had let the situation reach this point in the first place. He walked outside and told the contractor, calmly but firmly, exactly what the equipment was and what would happen if it were disturbed without the utility company present. The contractor hesitated. He said he was just following the work order. He said the woman who'd hired him, Daniel didn't need to ask which woman, had told him the homeowner would try to stop the crew and that he shouldn't listen because it was simply an obstruction tactic. By the time Daniel got Linda Whitmore on the phone, standing in his own backyard with his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years, the contractor had already begun working. He explained again what she was authorizing. She told him again that the board's decision was final and that continued interference would result in additional fines. And then, before Daniel could say another word, the line went dead, not because she hung up, but because at that exact moment, every phone on the block lost signal at once, along with every light, every refrigerator hum, every air conditioner cycling in the late summer heat. The contractor had disconnected the primary conductors without isolating the load side, without de-energizing the loop from the substation, without any of the sequence a licensed lineman would have followed in his sleep. The result wasn't a small contained outage. It was a cascading failure that tripped protective relays 2 substreets over, plunging 200 homes into sudden, simultaneous darkness in the middle of a weekday morning. Within 20 minutes, the street was filled with the low hum of confusion, garage doors that wouldn't open, thermostats blinking error codes, a dozen neighbors stepping outside to compare notes, assuming, as people always do, that it was simply a grid issue, a transformer fault somewhere upstream, nothing personal, nothing local. Daniel knew otherwise immediately. He'd spent his career reading exactly this kind of failure. He didn't need to see the equipment to know what had happened. He'd warned them, in writing, exactly what would. Within the hour, the utility company's emergency response team arrived, and it was here that the story took the turn nobody on that board had planned for. The lead engineer dispatched to investigate, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Anand, who had spent 15 years diagnosing exactly this category of grid failure, began her assessment the way she always did. Not with blame, but with data. Load readings, relay trip logs, a visual inspection of the equipment itself.
What she found at the Ferris property told the whole story before anyone said a word. A pad mount transformer, its primary connections crudely severed by tools never designed for the job, its enclosure partially disassembled by someone with landscaping equipment and no electrical certification whatsoever. It was, in the words she'd later use in her formal incident report, one of the most reckless, unauthorized interferences with protected utility infrastructure she had encountered in her career. She asked the obvious question first, the one that would become the story's title in every local news segment that followed. She asked why 200 homes had gone dark, and more specifically, she asked who had authorized work on live utility equipment without notifying the utility company, without permits, without so much as a call to the emergency line. Daniel didn't have to answer for himself. He simply handed her the folder.
8 months of correspondence, every certified letter, every fine notice, every email from the utility company confirming the easement, every warning he'd sent into the void of an HOA board too certain of its own authority to consider it might be wrong. Priya read through it standing in the Ferris driveway while a work crew began the delicate process of safely isolating and repairing the damaged equipment, and by the time she finished, her expression had shifted from professional neutrality into something closer to genuine disbelief. She made a call to her supervisor, then to the utility company's legal department. By early afternoon, as power began flickering back into homes across the neighborhood, one relay section at a time, a second vehicle pulled up outside the clubhouse, this one carrying not an engineer, but an attorney representing the utility company, along with a formal notice addressed directly to the Homeowners Association board. Word moves fast in a neighborhood that just spent 6 hours without power in 90-degree heat, and by the time the HOA's emergency meeting convened that evening, the clubhouse was fuller than it had been in years. Neighbors who had never once attended a board meeting showed up with questions nobody on the board could answer. Why had 200 households lost power over a beautification dispute? Why had a landscaping contractor been sent to disconnect live utility equipment? And why, several people wanted to know, had the board never once mentioned any of this to the community it claimed to be protecting? Linda Whitmore stood at the front of that room and for the first time in 9 years had no procedural language left to hide behind. The utility company's attorney had already outlined in blunt terms the liability the association now faced for property damage, for the cost of emergency repairs, for the outage itself, and potentially for reckless endangerment, given that unlicensed work on energized equipment could easily have resulted in injury or worse. The folder Daniel had kept, methodical and complete, wasn't just his defense anymore. It was the timeline of exactly how a board had ignored every warning available to it, in writing, for 8 straight months.
The weeks that followed unfolded with the particular grinding inevitability of consequences finally catching up to certainty. The utility company filed a formal claim against the Homeowners Association for the cost of emergency repairs, equipment replacement, and the investigation itself, a total that ran well into 6 figures once damaged relay equipment and overtime crew costs were factored in. Because the HOA carried standard liability insurance rather than anything designed for this kind of exposure, the claim triggered a review that put the association's entire financial standing under a magnifying glass for the first time in its history. What that review found didn't stay contained to the transformer incident. Once auditors and legal counsel started examining the board's decision-making processes, they found a pattern that had apparently been building for years. Assessments levied without proper notice, fines applied inconsistently across similar violations, meeting minutes that didn't match what residents remembered being discussed. The transformer had been the crack. Once it opened, everything else the board had gotten away with for nearly a decade came pouring out through it. A group of homeowners, energized by the outage and the discovery of just how loosely the board had been operating, organized a recall petition within 2 weeks. It gathered signatures faster than anyone expected, faster, several longtime residents noted, than any petition in the community's history.
Linda Whitmore resigned before the recall vote could formally take place, issuing a brief statement about stepping aside to let new leadership guide the community forward. The same bloodless procedural language she'd used in every violation letter she'd ever signed, now finally turned back on herself. Daniel didn't attend the recall meeting. He hadn't asked for an apology, hadn't demanded anyone's resignation, and had, in fact, spent most of those weeks simply trying to get his backyard repaired and his transformer properly secured under utility supervision, the way it should have been treated from the very first letter. But the folder he'd kept, calm, methodical, unglamorous, became something like local legend. Neighbors who had barely spoken to him before the outage now stopped by just to thank him, half joking that his habit of saving every email had probably saved the whole neighborhood from something far worse than a bad afternoon in the heat.
In the recall's aftermath, the new board that formed moved quickly to formalize what should have existed from the beginning. A documented review process requiring any dispute involving utility infrastructure to be verified directly with the utility company before any enforcement action, let alone physical intervention, could be authorized. It was, in essence, a rule built entirely around the shape of the mistake that had just been made. The kind of policy that only gets written after something breaks badly enough to make the need for it undeniable. For its utility company, the incident was used in its own internal training materials, a case study in what happens when a governing body with no technical authority decides it can override protected infrastructure through sheer procedural momentum. Priya Anand, the engineer who had stood in Daniel's driveway asking the question that started it all, later said in a local interview that the most unsettling part of the whole incident wasn't the outage itself, but how avoidable it had been. That every piece of information needed to prevent it had existed in writing for months, sitting unread in a filing cabinet at the clubhouse, ignored not out of malice exactly, but out of a kind of institutional arrogance that assumed authority was the same thing as being right. For Daniel and Carol, life in Willow Creek Estates settled back into something resembling its old quiet rhythm, though the neighborhood itself never quite returned to what it had been before. The holly bushes were replanted, taller and denser this time, at the utility company's recommendation and expense. The transformer hummed on behind them, doing the same invisible work it had always done. The same work every transformer on every street does, without anyone thinking twice about it. Until, of course, someone decides it's an eyesore worth fighting over.
What lingered longest wasn't the outage, or the fines, or even the recall. It was the simple, uncomfortable truth the whole ordeal had exposed, that a small group of people, elected by a fraction of a neighborhood's residents and answerable to almost no one, had been given quiet authority over decisions they didn't remotely understand, and had wielded that authority with total confidence anyway. Nobody on that original board had set out to plunge 200 homes into darkness. They had simply never once stopped to consider that they might be wrong, and by the time they were forced to consider it, the consequences had already spread far beyond a backyard, a folder, and a man who had only ever wanted them to ask a single question before they acted. Daniel still has that folder. He keeps it in the same drawer, though he hasn't needed to add to it in years. Every so often, when a new neighbor moves in and asks, half amused, about the story behind the reinforced fencing around the transformer at the back of his property, he tells it plainly, without embellishment, the way he tells most things. He doesn't dwell on the anger of those 8 months, or the satisfaction of watching a board that never once listened finally have to answer for it. What he tends to mention instead is simpler, and somehow more unsettling. That the entire outage, the recall, the 6-figure liability, all of it, could have been avoided by a single call to the utility company made before any letter was ever sent. So the next time a notice arrives in your mailbox citing some vague violation, threatening some vague consequence, signed by people who may have never once asked what they're actually threatening to touch, it might be worth asking yourself the same question that engineer asked, standing in that dark cul-de-sac. Not who's in charge, but whether the people in charge actually understand what they're in charge of. Before the lights go out,
and it's too late to ask.